5 years ago, a reformed Russian nation threw open the doors of its oldest museum. It revealed a collection like no other. The Kunstkammer is home to the bottled remains of 900 dismembered children, malformed fetuses, and severed limbs.
Христианской. Ну как, это же ведь все бывшие живые люди. Конечно, которые превратили Бог весть во что.
This peculiar chapter of medical history is not in any of the guidebooks to St. Petersburg, but its quiet unveiling has revived questions about the man who made it all. Who created this gallery of human specimens, and why? The 900 bodies now lying in Russia's national archives all lived and died 3 centuries ago in Amsterdam. While the explorers were discovering the world, here explorers of the human body were putting their names to everything they could uncover with a scalpel and a corpse. Eustachius conquered the unmapped territories of the ear, while Fallopius fearlessly charted the female reproductive organs. Suddenly, it seemed possible to dismantle the machinery of man and find out how he worked. This new breed of pioneer came from Protestant mercantile stock. The 17th century anatomists of Northern Europe modelled themselves on the tradesmen that dominated Amsterdam, forming guilds and commissioning the same self-promoting portraits, brandishing the emblems of their trade. A healthy interest in dissection was the hallmark of a cultivated mind, and by performing demonstrations on corpses, the top division surgeons could create a spectacular display of their expertise before an adoring public. They assumed a godlike authority and a ruthless monopoly on dissection. Dr. Frederick Ruysch entered this rarefied world in 1664. A well-born Dutch obstetrician, Ruysch's own peculiar talent lay in the arcane art of embalming. His obsessive, meticulous approach led him into new ways of exploring the human body and left his own name on the anatomical map in the Reuschian membrane of the eye. Anatomists were forced to prey on the fringes of society for their specimens. Criminals, foreigners, the insane, or, in Ruysch's case, simply the unbaptized. His specimens were some of the earliest experiments in anatomy, although it's hard to spot the medical research going on behind the winsome classical poses.
Productie die hij gemaakt heeft, denk je?
Ja, ik denk de Bon heeft een paar preparaten gekocht. En dus uit de collectie...
This was Ruysch's bold attempt to ally anatomy with fine art and help draw it into the mainstream. At the time, dissection was suffering from an unfortunate association with the gallows, and a bit of an image problem. The plump, rosy cheeks and lacy accessories belonged to the same propaganda campaign. For the surgeons of Amsterdam, pandering to public sensibilities was essential to success. At the time, dissection had a more immediate spin-off than mere medicine. It offered mystery, science fiction, and dismemberment in a package the public would pay for. The early anatomy theatres marketed dissection as a dignified ritual, with church architecture and orchestral music. It was a tradition that had begun with the very first dissections performed at the University of Bologna in 1300. The corpses were opened according to a strict protocol, belly first, followed by the chest, and finally the head as students read aloud from the teachings of Aristotle and Galen.
A little branch crossing over to the ulnar nerve branch. Can you see? Can you see that? Yeah.
All perfectly formed animals are to be divided into three parts. 1. That by which food is taken in. 2. That by which excrement is discharged. And the third, the region intermediate between them, called the chest. All those that are also capable of movement have additional members, to wit, legs and feet. Now, it is evident, both by observation and by inference, that the soul is in the middle of these three parts. Hence, the body organs may be thought of as many separate animals grown together.
But as you've all seen with the dissections, it's very rare to see.
Ruysch succeeded Tulp as a professor of anatomy to the surgeons of Amsterdam. In 1666, he gave a public demonstration of his own. He enlisted his entire family in the enterprise. Mary, his wife, acted as his assistant, their daughter Rachel crocheted the lace, and their son Hendrik worked on the preparation. Ruysch is said to have confided the precious secret of embalming to him. Ruysch was riding high after the publication of his own small volume on the discovery of valves in the lymphatic system. In typical style, he went on to count and individually document 2,000 of them. Ruysch's discovery was more significant than he could have known. It marked a time when anatomy itself was changing radically. The discoverers of the human body had embarked on their quest with boundless optimism, determined to conquer this remote and strange terrain. But now they were beginning to sense that the body was too vast, too complex to be conquered. The geographical metaphors gave way to a new view of the body as a working machine. The Church was one of the first to seize on this latest trend. If the human body was a machine, it required a maker.
Allora c'era Papa Lambertini, che cardinale prima in Bologna, poi Papa a Roma, che ebbe appunto questa idea di costituire una vera e propria scuola di anatomia dove venissero costruite con la cera le parti anatomiche in modo che i medici potessero dal vero studiare quelle parti che non era possibile analizzare specificamente nei cadaveri.
To strip down the fabric of the human body without offending people's sensibilities, scientists had looked for substitutes in dissection. While the anatomists of Amsterdam were embalming and sanitizing the real thing, in southern Europe, there was a long tradition of learning from anatomical dummies made out of wax. Two of the greatest artists in this tradition were Giovanni Manzolini and Ercole Lelli, who lived and worked shortly after Ruysch in Italy.
Il più stretto collaboratore di Ercole Lelli era Giovanni Manzolini. Giovanni Manzolini sfortunatamente subentrò ad Ercole Lelli alla sua morte, ma vi rimase alla cattedra dell'anatomia solo per qualche anno. Morì infatti forse per pazzia. Giovanni Manzolini, che qui vediamo in questo ritratto, opera di Anna Morandi Manzolini, la moglie di Giovanni Manzolini. Anna Morandi Manzolini fece poi il proprio autoritratto, dove qui si presenta in un atto di dissezione del cervello dopo di aver scallottato la calotta cranica. E fu Anna Morandi Manzolini che poi continuò nella sua produzione, e forse anche perché non era all'inizio particolarmente accettata dal pubblico scientifico.
Art had anticipated science during the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci had famously studied anatomy in monastery hospitals, believing that to draw the human figure, one must know what is beneath the skin. The religious authorities, for their part, condoned dissection as physical proof of the ingenious design of man. In Northern Europe, Ruysch was creating his own religious works. Dissection also served the Protestant ethic of self-examination and was a graphic reminder of the transience of life. None of Ruysch's religious allegories have survived. It was said that a monk stumbled across these tiny skeletons and was so moved he decided to give them a Christian burial. But the engravings illustrate Ruysch's greatest technical triumph and what was to become his trademark, the technique of injecting substances into organs to reveal their blood vessels. The magical substance which could be injected into blood vessels had been invented by Ruysch's friend, John Swammerdam. He was the first person to reveal the capillaries of the face. But Swammerdam's religion led him to believe the technique was impious. So he handed it to Ruysch, who adapted it, improved it, and used it to explore the entire body. The great embalmers and preparators kept their ingredients secret, but Ruysch seems to have used a combination of wax, resin, cinnabar, and talcum powder. It was a delicate cocktail. The injected fluid had to perfuse all the vessels without rupturing them, and then harden, only after it had filled the complete system. At a time when anatomical specimens were hard to come by, Ruysch could now preserve the few he had for eternity.
These injections were so wondrous that they attained the offshoots of the finest capillaries. The specimens prepared gave one the impression that they were alive, not corpses, and far from having a nauseous smell, even acquired an agreeable one, in spite of the fact that I had operated on subjects in an advanced state of putrefaction.
The circulation of the blood, pumped by the heart, had famously been postulated 40 years earlier by the surgeon to the English court, William Harvey.
During a contraction, the heart rises up and hits the thoracic wall. One can feel it harden with one's hand, and at the same time it pales, which proves that at that moment the blood which filled the heart is being expelled. If we now consider the quantity and rapidity of blood flow, the veins would soon become empty if it were not somehow possible for the blood to return from the arteries. This is how I began to wonder if there were not a circular movement of blood in the body.
It was a triumph of the experimental method, which Harvey had learned from René Descartes, at that time conducting his own research in Amsterdam. Descartes returned the compliment.
Everyone who has not been completely blinded by the authority of the ancients and who is willing to open his eyes to examine Harvey's opinion on the circulation of the blood can be in no doubt that the body's veins and arteries are like vessels through which the blood flows endlessly and with great rapidity. The two cavities of the heart are like two locks through which every drop of blood passes each time it courses through the body.
Modern medicine was born in the anatomy theatres of Amsterdam and Leiden. The 17th century brought the scientific method of hypothesis from hard evidence. And in this century, its pioneers have been vindicated. Direct measurements of the circulation have supported many of Harvey's original ideas.
Voilà notre petit guide métallique qui nous sert à nous diriger. Et là, on va monter vers le haut, ici, à la racine du bras, pour aller dans une artère qui va monter dans le cou et qui nous intéresse. Une artère, voilà, c'est celle-là, qui s'appelle l'artère vertébrale, et qui va constituer notre route vers les structures intracrâniennes.
Nos ancêtres les poissons, bien entendu, se nourrissaient beaucoup d'eau et de fait, le sang est quelque chose qui est apparu bien après que nous n'ayons eu un système circulatoire et quelque chose qui circule dedans et qui soit nourricier. Et en particulier, on ne peut pas s'empêcher de penser que la vascularisation, en tous les cas la distribution des feuilles et de la sève, est le passé le plus rustique, à la fois le plus simple et le plus primitif de notre circulation sanguine. Eh bien, le cerveau humain, dans notre stade aquatique, in utero, se rappelle que l'eau est nourrissante ou nourricière et pendant très longtemps se nourrit d'eau.
But in a strange way, Ruysch's work anticipated all of this. His injections revealed the capillaries 20 years before the microscope was invented. And he had already reached his own conclusions about the importance of circulation as the basis of life.
When he was already an aged man in his 80s, he became interested in the structure of plants and fruits, and he used several specimens for the illustrations of his medical notations he made, and he compared, for instance, the fibrous construction of a pear with the vascular construction in human organs. So you can see here, for instance, the mesenterium, which is a part of the abdominal structures in man, compared with leaves, which he had brushed out. He is convinced that the vascular or fibrous structures determine the subject.
Ruysch laboured on his collection for nearly 3/4 of a century, expanding the focus on anatomy with plants, stuffed fish, birds and butterflies. The aim was to stun rather than to educate. Collectors vied for the biggest, the most beautiful and the weirdest. Ruysch's appointment as doctor to the Dutch court in 1679 provided him with ample material for his preparations and became the basis of the most celebrated anatomical collection in Europe. For foreigners, one of the greatest marvels in the Netherlands was Dr. Ruysch's laboratory. Only scholars admired it with dignity. Others only wanted to be able to boast of having seen it. Kings came along with the rest. Their grand titles prove how widespread his renown was. When Tsar Peter the Great came to Holland for the first time in 1698, he was awestruck, transported when he saw Ruysch's laboratory. He tenderly kissed the body of a still lovable baby, who seemed to smile at him. Ruysch's association with Russia's most infamous Tsar was to become the most important and profitable of his life. It was an unlikely alliance, the manic despot and the meticulous embalmer. But Peter was a determined man of the Enlightenment. On visits to the West, he regularly sought out scientific collections and churned his magnificent city of St. Petersburg out of the swampland, just to position himself closer to Europe. Peter had an insatiable curiosity and an obsessive desire to teach his subjects everything he learned. He began a personal crusade against ignorance and prejudice, particularly the fear of physical deformities. The Tsar was determined to eradicate the religious superstitions surrounding birth defects. He issued a decree ordering his subjects to hand over all deformed creatures to the authorities. The rewards varied from 100 rubles for a live human being to 3 rubles for a dead bird. Peter argued that exposing his subjects to these monstrous creatures would teach them that they were neither born of the devil nor by magic, but were all God's children. Ironically, Peter's enlightened attitude towards deformity seems to have grown out of his own oddity. Peter was something of a curiosity himself. Massive in an age of short subjects, he grew to nearly 7 feet tall. His abnormal height seemed to feed his taste for reveling with the physically deformed. For years he kept at court a 7-foot giant he had found in Calais. He seemed to enjoy cavorting with dwarves even more, supporting a large population as human pets. In 1717, Peter realized a long-held ambition. He bought Ruysch's entire anatomical collection and shipped it back to St. Petersburg. It had cost him 30,000 guilders, a massive sum of money. But to Peter, it brought the elegance and sophistication of old Europe into the heart of his new capital, emblems of Russia's modernization.
Когда в России вообще никто не знал про анатомию, там про такие вот вещи. Я забыл, как это называется. Сам процесс.
The Russian people were less impressed, and Peter had to resort to bribing visitors inside with the offer of a piece of meat and a complimentary vodka, where they would receive his sermon.
And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him dominate the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, and the cattle, and all the reptiles which creep upon the earth." Now the most noble of creatures, the microcosm of all the whole great earth, has appeared on the world's theatre. Now that table is well laid, the host comes to sit before it.
Они, понимаете, ребята, они сами уже берут такие эпизодики и уже сами вылавливают вас. Сюда хорошо кадры.
Alongside Ruysch's works, Peter installed his other curiosities. His large collection of human teeth, all personally pulled by the Tsar, who fancied himself as a dentist, and his extensive range of surgical tools. In a final parting gesture, Peter then added himself to the collection. When he was close to death, he commissioned a mechanical effigy to stand alongside his natural history specimens.
I want you to consider that all the functions which are attributed to man, like the digestion of meat, the beating of the heart and the arteries, breathing, wakefulness and sleep, the interior movements of the appetites and passions, I want you to consider that all these functions within this machine naturally follow the disposition of its organs, neither more nor less than the movements of a clock follow the movements of its balance weight and gears. We will avoid a very considerable error into which many have fallen. It consists of the fact that seeing that all dead bodies lose their heat and then their power of movement, one imagined that it was the absence of the soul which made these movements and this heat cease. But death never arrives as a result of a fault of the soul, but only because one of the principal parts of the body has broken down, and the body of a living man is as different from that of a dead man as a watch, when it has been wound, is different from the same watch when it is broken, and the mechanism determining its movement ceases to function.
When the Tsar died in 1725, Ruysch was 87 years old. He had already built himself a new laboratory, which he subsequently sold to the King of Poland. One day, when speaking of his critics, he said, "They thought they had triumphed over me, but their ashes had been locked away in their tombs for a long time, whereas the Almighty preserved my life that I might perfect my art." The following year, he broke his leg and took leave of his students in Leiden. Ruysch finally died 2 years later, at the age of 93.